Good morning, everyone. Today's webinar is Planning and Infrastructure to Support Community Priorities. I have as our special guest today Jason Calla. I've known Jason for quite a while now on infrastructure and housing projects, and so we reached out to the First Nation Infrastructure Institute, who I believe are extremely well positioned to talk about this project. So I'll turn over to Jason and go ahead.
Great. Thanks, John, for the introduction. Yeah, my name's Jason Calla. I'm coming to you today from Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, but I hail from Coast Salish territory and the West Coast from the Squamish Nation. Um, I have a background in urban and regional planning studies and have done work with my own community and with some of the First Nations fiscal institutions, the First Nations Financial Management Board and the First Nation Tax Commission. And I'm working with an initiative called the First Nations Infrastructure Institute, and pleased to be here today to talk to you about planning and infrastructure projects to support community priorities. I got involved with this organization probably about 5 years ago when Chief Commissioner Manny Jules asked if I'd be interested in helping out with this infrastructure idea. I have some experience thinking about these issues from some community planning work we've done with our own community. We have a high demand for housing and not enough supply and not enough land. And so in the early 2000s, our nation was seeking to acquire more land so we could add that land to reserve and we could build more housing for our members. And what I learned through that process is that the land costs were something, but the infrastructure costs were considerably more. And so at that point, I realized the challenges that we're probably facing. A lot of communities, not only my own, but that's how do you plan for infrastructure, for water, for sewer, for roads, for internet connectivity, um, and how do you pay for it? And how do you find it? How can you spread those costs over time and manage it in a way to respond to membership priorities? So we have been working on this Infrastructure Institute idea for a little while. We've developed I think, some best practices and some ideas for planning a project, and was hoping to talk to you today about some of those ideas and introduce you a little bit to the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. Instead of talking in the abstract about sort of just generally infrastructure, I thought it might be helpful to actually think about an illustrative project, and that this maybe grounds us in thinking about how we're trying to really respond to different community priorities. This is an illustrative map. This is not representative of any individual nation, but I think probably reflective of what we've heard from a number of communities in terms of different types of land uses. This may very well build on some of the material that you have been doing, John, and some of your other webinars about zoning and land use. You can see this map here is showing some First Nation lands and identifying some different types of land use. In the yellow, you can see some member residential areas, where there's existing housing, on First Nation lands. We've also got an area there of a commercial center. I can imagine, in many communities, there's some economic development, could be retail development, retail stores, could be a gas station, could be any other kind of office space. Some communities I know have that type of development on their lands. Certainly community buildings, it could be an area for administration buildings, for a school, for a health center, for an elders building. Could be any number of community buildings. I know one thing that I hear more about lately is communities interested in assuming responsibility for child and family services. And that could mean the requirement to have space for those services to be provided. And in addition, we've got sort of towards the left-hand side, we've got some waterfront. In this case, this reserve is located on a lakefront, and we've got some lots that are leased. I could imagine some communities have some residential development for market housing that they do. In some cases, it's the nation doing it. In other cases, it could be CP holders that are, leasing out some of their lots for cottages, for example. So we've got a variety of land uses here. Communities got some existing land uses and very well could be engaged in some sort of land use planning exercise, maybe a comprehensive community planning exercise, looking to the future and looking to what some future land use might be on their lands. And you can see in the hatched area, the hatched yellow area there, there's more member residential contemplated. And in addition, you can imagine more, waterfront lease lots in the future. So just to acknowledge, again, this is just illustrative, an exercise to help us think about how infrastructure, would be developed and planned to support these various land uses, and to support growth into the future. So, on the map again, we have a few different in the legend there. You can see the water. In this case, we talk about a water project. You could have a water supply. In this case, we're drawing water from the lake. Um, some sort of treatment plant facility in the square, some sort of storage tank, which could be helpful to manage sort of peak flows during certain times, or additionally for fire suppression and protection. And of course, with these different supply treatment plant, storage tank locations, there needs to be a distribution system. So we've got in the dotted line showing the distribution system. So that, when we think about like what is an infrastructure project, we know there's lots of different, ideas about what infrastructure is. Um, but of course, one core thing that I think a lot of communities would consider infrastructure is water and wastewater, and certainly in the context of, building more housing, whether it's um, member member owned, community owned land, or whether it's CP land, whether it's market housing, and whatever type of housing it is, it's still going to require water and sewer. And so this is kind of the illustrative example I think I'd like to sort of propose there as we sort of work through, well, how can we move forward if you're trying to build 10 new houses in that hatched area for member residential. What do we need to do to make sure there's enough capacity? We're getting enough water for those houses. The treatment plant is able to treat enough water. There's enough capacity within the whole system that if we build 10 more houses, we're going to be able to manage the whole water system at peak flows. We want to make sure that the whole system's working properly. So just move on, and we'll come back to that example, as we move through and think, okay, well, what are the things that we can do? What type of best practices are possible to use to plan this infrastructure project so that you can build those houses? And again, I just want to introduce you to the idea of the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. It is proposed to be a fourth institution under the First Nation Fiscal Management Act to join the other three that have been established by the Act. Some of you may be familiar already with the First Nations Financial Management Board, the First Nations Finance Authority, and the First Nation Tax Commission. Those organizations have been established since about 2005, and it's optional for First Nations to use those services. I think there's around, over 300 nations across the country that have decided to opt into the Act and are using some of the tools or all of the tools. The Financial Management Board, of course, certifies financial performance and financial management systems. And once you have a certificate that you're in good shape, you can go to the First Nation Finance Authority and apply for a loan, a long-term loan that you can use local revenues to repay that loan over time. And so there's lots of communities doing really good stuff with the tools in the toolbox at the First Nation Fiscal Management Act. I think we're just proposing to add a few more tools to the toolbox, as it were, and establish FINI as a fourth organization. The mission of FINI is really to provide the skills and processes necessary to ensure First Nations and Indigenous organizations efficiently and effectively plan, procure, own, and manage infrastructure assets on their lands. And so again, we've got a few words in there you may have seen through some of your other webinars, maybe talking about procurement and planning and operations and maintenance and asset management and things. So, um, the whole approach is really for Finney is built on that strategic model that the FMA is based on. That is their indigenous led organizations. In the case of Finney, it wouldn't be of course, a financial management or a tax organization. It'd be infrastructure focused and really establishing best practices and standards with respect to the planning of projects. Those are some of the standards and best practices we've been thinking about and trying to understand, and that we're going to talk about in some of the slides here. Really, to be a center of excellence, we know these types of projects don't happen all the time. So it may be the case that a wastewater treatment plant is 25 years old. It's reaching the end of its expected life, and there needs to be an upgrade or a replacement of the plant. Well, the people who were involved in the plant originally may have retired by now or moved on to other things. And so you're not able to have a lot of corporate knowledge about, how to procure and develop tender documents for a complicated project like this. So it's helpful to maybe to have a center of excellence where you can, learn best practices, learn how to avoid the pitfalls, and the Finney really being established as part of the legislation is important to clarify what the mandate of the organization is and to clarify how it'll work, with the other organizations. So, certainly, again, Finney being optional, if a First Nation chose to work with Finney, the idea is really just bringing a bit more bench strength to the team. These projects are complex. They can take some time in terms of planning. And so Finney as a partner can work with you and really meet you where you want to be in terms of the level of capacity support that can be provided. And I know in different parts of the country, there's different types of organizations that exist out there. Of course, individuals working within a First Nation, including, elected leadership, senior management, department heads, for example, in public works and finance. Um, there could be also, regional organizations. We see emerging organizations like the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority in Atlantic Canada, but other organizations, technical services organizations like the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Group, the Alberta Technical Services Group. There's others. Could be tribal councils. They could be providing some services. So really, part of the building a project team and Finney, not displacing, not really just being, like I say, a third or fourth liner coming to bring some bench strength, and also could be external advisors, right? Like existing engineers, existing planners. We see communities working with advisors on land code, land use plans, for example. And part of the question in developing a land use plan might be well, how are we going to service these proposed uses? Well, Finney can be part of the team and support the planning of that. So really establishing this project team in order to develop the project, to build knowledge and transfer it, and really to deliver that project. So that's a quick introduction to what Finney's all about. It's really the services are free of charge. We're in a development phase at Finney. We're hopeful that it will be established shortly with a legislative amendment. But in the meantime, certainly able to do capacity building workshops and talk about some of these best practices. If you want to learn a bit more, please head over to fnii.ca. You can learn a bit more. I've got that on a slide at the end of the deck here, but I want to come back to this illustrative project we were talking about. So, we've got maybe some existing infrastructure in place. We need to expand the system, and we want to work through the Finney process to develop the project. So here's these best practices. This slide, I know it's a little bit busy. I'm going to take a quick drink of water before we get started on this one. It's really, it looks a little bit overwhelming, but really this is the life cycle of a project. And this has been adapted and developed by the Finney technical team using best practices that have been identified, nationally here in Canada, off reserve, internationally even in other countries, and certainly incorporating experience and the circumstance that Indigenous communities find themselves in here in Canada to try and say, okay, well, what would be the good steps to take in developing the project, in identifying it? That's really the project identification phase at the top row there. Sounds maybe a bit simple, but it can be, when we start really trying to define what an infrastructure project is, it can take some work to get there. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But, um, once you've identified the project and your project team and sort of documented that, your roles and responsibilities into some sort of project charter and work plan, then it's really starting to build a business case. And this business case phase is we're gonna break that apart in a few slides here. Um, really five parts of it: the why, the strategic case, the technical case, the feasibility study and the technical options, analyzing procurement models, the advantages and disadvantages in the commercial case, developing a whole of life financial model that takes into account those whole of life costs, and a management case of how the project's going to be managed and how the community is going to be involved in the project throughout its life cycle. So that's really building that business case. And then moving on to, once you've built the business case, saying, okay, well, how are we going to go out and find a firm to work with us that's going to be able to build the project the way we want it to be built, and it's going to meet our objectives. And that takes the information in the business plan and preparing the tender documents, maybe shortlisting the bidders to the ones that you think have the best capability to respond to the proposal, sending out the request for proposals and receiving the bids and evaluating the bids and then awarding the contract. And that's the third row there. And then, that brings us to construction. And the bottom row, which may be a little bit of a misrepresentation, it doesn't look like a very long period of time in this picture, but it's probably the longest, right? The operation and maintenance. Hopefully it's going to last for a long time, this asset. So that's the kind of like general, Finney process we would think. And again, I know it may seem a little bit like, oh my gosh, there's a lot here, but for any infrastructure project, what we understand is for it to be successful, there's different aspects, things that have to be done, work has to be done, planning has to be done to make it successful. These are the types of things that will, if you're able to complete them, we understand that will make your project successful. And so what we see Finney doing is really supporting you to optimize that project, to get these different pieces of work done. How can Finney support that? Working with you as part of the project team, providing tools, providing templates, doing workshops to support you so you don't have to start from scratch on these things. So I'm just going to continue to move through a few slides here, and really, if I think I go back to this Finney process, diagram, and we concentrate on that second row. So again, I say the first row, our experience, and we're working on a couple of pilot projects right now, one in Ontario and one in Atlantic Canada. Um, it has taken a bit of time, meeting with chief and council, meeting with people from the different administrative departments, identifying the various infrastructure projects that are, on the table for the community, trying to prioritize which ones need to happen in which order for things to go ahead. And of course, water and wastewater continue to emerge as these foundational infrastructure projects that really support a whole lot of other things to happen. So, um, pulling that together and then bringing it to council and getting a mandate. Okay, we're going to form this project team. We're going to get started on this work. And now we're into, developing that business case. And, you know, we sort of concurrently start to think through these different aspects of the business case. And the strategic case is really that, why are you doing the project? And being able to link, um, you know, the particular infrastructure project back to foundational planning documents like a comprehensive community plan is really helpful because you're going to have questions as you go along through the technical options. You're going to have questions as you go along through the procurement, through the financial, and to the extent that you're able to sort of reflect on the strategic case, it really can provide guidance, I think, to how you address questions as you move forward with other questions in the other parts of the plan. So, we've seen comprehensive community plans. They don't just include, a section on infrastructure that says we should upgrade it. They have sections on other aspects like, environmental protection, public health, capacity development, economic development, and these different aspects of the community plan are like I say, helpful in questions that may arise in other aspects of the business case. You may have a land use plan. I know, John, you were mentioning, maybe there's zoning that exists. All these things are helpful to inform the business case here. So really investigating and exploring what kind of planning is available. It's not that you have to have all these things done, but I think to the extent that you can understand what direction is provided in these plans, it really is a helpful guide. Some communities may have a multi-year financial plan, especially if you're working with the financial management board or even a capital plan. And so all of these things can be incorporated into a strategic case that provides some guidance and direction as to why the project's being undertaken.
See, we've been talking about a lot of our webinars, the essence of comprehensive planning, because you don't know where you're going to put your house if you don't have a plan, and you don't know how you're going to, set out a subdivision or even, setbacks if you don't have a plan. So we've been emphasizing the absolute importance of some type of land use plan and zoning and making sure or encouraging communities to use their authority having jurisdiction. That's responsibility. If you want a sound community, you need to do this. We need to stop building disposable houses on plots of land that doesn't make any sense, right?
Well, exactly, yeah. And maybe it's even more cost effective when you think those things through, isn't it?
Totally agree. Yeah, then you know at least how much, feet of pipe you're gonna use. So I've been in communities, and probably so have you, where infrastructure just stops because they didn't do a community setback properly. It's gonna cost them too much to put an elbow in, so they stop it.
Right. Yeah, and I know another that, we've come up thinking about these kinds of things like, okay, well, we're getting to the technical options. Who's going to get connected to the wastewater system and who's going to stay on septic? Now, if we connect every single house to the wastewater system, that could be very, very expensive. And may not make sense to connect every single person because some of the houses may be not very, close together, may be totally fine to keep on septic. And from an economic perspective, sensible. Other places, geez, well, they're right near these environmentally sensitive areas. There's rising water table. Existing septic systems are not functioning very well. Um, there's public health issues with standing water. Geez, we should really think about, addressing some of those public health, environmental, issues by making sure we can connect them. Um, so I think that's sort of all of these things make a lot of sense, John, that you mentioned.
Yeah, good comments. Good comments.
So the technical case is really that feasibility study, and probably people are familiar with the idea of doing feasibility studies, hiring an engineer um, to come in and try and present you with some technical options that could solve, the challenge you're trying to address. Um, and also provide you with some cost estimate. And the cost estimate can help you determine, how are we going to fund the project. So I think this has been like a real a good exercise we've done in our pilot projects is thinking about well, first of all, even who are you going to hire to do the feasibility study? So have you prepared an RFP for a feasibility study before? What kind of objectives do you have? What kind of information are you going to provide? as background information to the engineers so they can do their work. Um, and then, once the work's the firm's been selected, thinking through, some of the technical options, we think about water or wastewater. We think about what are the technologies that may exist to treat those things. We think in a wastewater context, what about management of biosolids? Um, we think about collection network or supply network, for water or wastewater and distribution, I guess. So there's all these different options, and again, thinking to how you're going to evaluate them, and the engineers may come and say, well, geez, here's our first cut at where we think who should be connected, and of course, the nation's staff and management probably has a lot better knowledge than the engineers, local knowledge of things, on the lands that, places to avoid or things to consider. And so I think having that strong connection, not just getting a study at the end, but participating in workshops with the engineers, evaluating those technical options against criteria you've established, um, working through the scoring of them to see the recommended solution, and yeah, and then coming to some conclusion on a cost estimate, which of course is a challenge now if the feasibility study is gets out of date too far because of cost escalation issues and things. But important part, technical case, technical options, and certainly I think an area that Finney's able to provide a bit of technical support in terms of tools and templates and some best practices around that. The next part is the commercial case, and it sounds like you've done some work on procurement. I know this term procurement can be used in a lot of different contexts, and sometimes can be misunderstood. I know when we were doing a pilot project, John, and we had some community engagement sessions, and um, we were talking, doing a presentation in a way similar to what we're talking about here today with community members, and we were in the gym, and we talked about procurement and used that word about 3 or 4 times, and somebody at the back of the room raised their hand, and the microphone came over to them, and they said, "What the hell do you mean by procurement?" So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
so it's there is a lot of jargon, right, with all of infrastructure, and really in this context, I think what we're seeing is First Nation has got an infrastructure project, and they're going to try and find a company, a partner to partner with to help them build the project. And the project's got some complicated things to it. It's not like going to the mall, you're buying an iPhone. There's iPhones with different models of them and different features. Well, in the case of an infrastructure project, is very it can be very different ideas about it and different ways of constructing it. And so, being able to provide the right information to a potential contractor that you could partner with to build your project, being clear about what responsibilities that they will have to design the project, to build the project, even to operate or maintain the project, and what responsibilities the nation will retain to do any of those activities. These are really important and can be some complex things to identify. And you do that through, the tender documents. You do that through the contract that you have, and you build a plan for that tendering and those contracts through the commercial case. And that's what this slide talks about a little bit. It can be very jargony. There's a bit of an alphabet soup about different models. And I think the point that I would just want to make here is that there's no perfect model for all projects, or and it really depends on what the community's objectives are in terms of what model would best fit for them. But what I would say is that probably one consistent theme that we have for Finney is that it's important to do some sort of due diligence around which model you're gonna pick. So it's important to talk about what the advantages and the disadvantages of the different models are. It's important to identify the objectives you have, and it's important to do that sort of discussion and then come to some, conclusion about what your preferred approach is. Certainly there's some resources there on the Finney website about some of the different models, some of the advantages and disadvantages, but we think this is also actually a little bit of a departure from the way ISK has done things. They've tended to do things on a design bid build contract, which tends to, again, my understanding is the nation tends to retain a lot of risk um, at the end. And so we're wondering, and again, it'll depend on the analysis for each project, but are there other models out there that might be better suited and that the nation might prefer?
Yeah, this is well done. As you probably know, we did a series of booklets on procurement for the housing area. And it's interesting because it is based on already you have a design, right? So that's really the big difference where in this case you got to make the design. So, when a First Nations doing a housing, okay, they got it a house. They have an idea of a house. So it's less complicated per se, but the stages are similar, right? You have a tender, you got to qualify the contractors. We've been strong advocates of using CCDC documents as well and using those as templates as because we think they're also, you know, there's nothing new here as we know. Like this has been well developed by other reputable organizations. It's just how do we dovetail it down to the communities, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Great. So I'll move on to the financial case. We've got a couple of slides here, and um, part of the certainly part of the challenge we understand from a lot of communities we've been talking to is that sometimes there's the focus on the construction costs, but they're not necessarily linked to operation and maintenance costs. And we know that, ISK provides some O&M dollars for infrastructure. We know that they are not linked to the actual, costs that are required for O&M, and as a result, so sometimes we see not the appropriate amount of reinvestment into operation and maintenance, and the result of that is that the assets don't last as long as you would hope they would. And so I think one of the things we want to do here is developing a financial case that does take into account, that whole O&M plan. And again, you sort of think back to to the interaction between the different parts of this business case. When you're reviewing those technical options for the infrastructure in the technical case, you very well could have, a situation where um, the construction costs are relatively lower up front, and then you have relatively higher operating and maintenance costs later, or you could have higher costs up front, and perhaps you could have relatively low. I'm not saying that's the case in all these projects. It's just all I'm saying is, these different technical options, they have implications here for the financial case and the timing of the costs. And so we're encouraging that as a best practice to think about that whole of life costs and then really think about, okay, well, how are we going to pay for these things? Are there some
Yeah.
principles that we could establish? Um, in terms of, for example, economic development, if there's an economic development project, when that project is using the water and wastewater system, for example, should there be a fair and equitable allocation of those costs to that particular use? And so we think back to that map, right, that we were talking about. Well, what portion of the cost of the overall system? Well, there's the cost of the pipe to get there, but is there also a portion of the treatment plant? Is there also a portion of the storage facility? How do you allocate out some of those costs? And it's not, there are ways to do that. And so that's just being transparent and developing a financial model that can do that. And of course, some costs are the responsibility of Canada, like for member housing, for example, right? So, but again, is there a way to have a system that works effectively for the community, There are tools available through the Fiscal Management Act to recover some costs, to do some long-term borrowing. I know this is sort of one of the questions that's come up too. We say, okay, well, we want to do an upgrade to the system and we want to connect, people to address the health issues, to address the environmental issues. And one of the reactions is like, oh my gosh, like that's going to be super expensive. We can't afford to do that. Well, there's tools that are available so that you can do that actually. So you can spread the costs out over time. And that's what these FMA tools do. So I think it's helpful to just work through what some of the tools are, what some of the options are. And again, that's what Finney can really support. The nation will be the decider of how they proceed with the case, but having a bit of technical support to work through some of these options, I think can be quite helpful.
See, we talked about similar in housing. If you go back to the slide, so we've been advocating the importance of rental regimes for, notwithstanding the debate of is housing a treaty right. Housing is not free, and so there's got to be a cost. And as part of that cost, there can be surcharges for water and sewer, similar to what I pay living off reserve. I pay surcharges for that, and so we've been talking to housing managers. It's not only rent; it's also the supplies of garbage pickup, water surcharges, infrastructure surcharges to those homes. And if you had a building permit system, then you could actually add your surcharges on those new homes to recoup your costs. So we've been also talking about the importance of costs associated with building permits to recoup these costs.
Yeah, great stuff. And yeah, it's just like really thinking through what I think what one of the things that we've done in the pilot projects is started and said, well, let's take a look at what you're doing now. Like, what are the costs associated with the operation and maintenance of the wastewater system? You know, what are the revenues that you're collecting right now? And I think what we see is that the costs are what the costs are, but the nation's maybe not being able to collect enough revenue to pay for them, right? Whether it's from lessees, whether it's contributions from Canada, the math just doesn't add up, and that puts, of course, staff in a very difficult position trying to manage the asset with limited resources. So yeah, that sounds like a great plan, John, which is just to, yeah, work through your financial model, work through what your costs are, figure out what the tools are that you have available to be able to collect them, and then build your model. And again, this is not to say this is the correct model for everyone, this chart that is here, but it's just maybe a way to show how we're starting to think about these things. And that's okay, well, there's capital costs. Let's talk about the construction costs first. And we have this project, it's going to have certain funding requirements that have been identified in that technical case. Okay, well, who are the beneficiaries? Who are the users of the system? And, in this case, we've identified three categories. That's not to say these are the only categories you can have, but it's just identifying some users of the system and then saying, okay, well, if those are the users, what are the reasonable funding options for these users. So you can see for members, for example, would there be a contribution from ISK? That would be a logical source. We have this idea of monetized transfers, and that's to say if you had a long-term transfer agreement, could you finance some of these costs over time and use the money from the transfer agreement to repay the debt? That's a concept we're certainly trying to explore. For economic development, and by that I guess we mean like retail development or commercial development. Would we be using the Fiscal Management Act tools or other revenues? And maybe there's a non-member resident, a larger residential development, and can you do some project? And again, not to say these are the exact answers, but this is the sort of, I think, the style of thinking or the way of approaching the challenge that may help you to develop a plan. And this, John, maybe is getting to your point about the operating cost, is it? So just to say,
Yeah,
there's not,
absolutely.
yeah, not just the capital cost, but how do you recoup costs on an ongoing basis? And are there fees? Are there other FMA tools? to do like, and I know water, wastewater, garbage, like classic examples where maybe there's an annual fee to cover the cost of some of those things. And you know, maybe, and again, not to say these things all fit in the right box at the moment, but what about other revenue options? You know, where I know there's discussion of things like, you know, sales tax and cannabis tax and um, you know, other revenue sources, like maybe First Nation even has impact benefit agreement or you know, some sort of project they're involved with that they're able to bring some revenue stream to the project.
Yep.
So again, not to, you know, these are just a scenario. This picture is another scenario. How would you uh, bring together the funding for the project? How could you work with the FMA First Nations? First Nation is in the middle of the picture here. They've got an infrastructure project they're trying to develop. You know, you've got a number of funding sources. Certainly, Canada is going to make a contribution with the fiscal transfer. Could be some local and other revenues. You could be getting a loan through FNFA, you know, getting certified by FNB, working with Finney to advance the project business case and collecting some local revenues from FNTC. All these things could be, you know, we would hope, you know, form a picture where there's a, you know, a more sustainable approach to funding infrastructure projects. Yeah, and again, last but not least, I just want to come back to that management case. Um, it's certainly been learning as we've been working on these pilot projects, you know, identifying the different members of the project team and continuing to communicate effectively. We've got some ideas for possible, you know, positions here in different administrative departments. I know, John, you're talking to, you know, building officers and housing a lot. And of course, that's you know, an important aspect, but you could have, you know, different members of the team involved in how do you organize your team and build that management case about how you're going to continue through the planning and so these things, geez, these things change from time to time. There's council elections. Sometimes people leave for other opportunities. And, you know, the infrastructure project isn't a 6 month project, it's a multi-year project. So, how do you keep some continuity when you have people changing as well as a question, right?
Well, it's also trying to work out of the silos as well, which is really imperative, I think, especially on an infrastructure, because, well, housing is just a portion and a big portion of it, but everybody needs to work collectively in order to know where all um, various aspect of that infrastructure projects taking place. So it's critical, absolutely critical.
Yeah, and then of course people, you know, there's people within the administration, the governance structure. What
Yeah.
about there's other people that you might want to be engaging with? What about CP holders? What about membership? What about leaseholders, cottagers? What about, you know, other private sector developers? Do you have a trailer park? Is that a different consideration? So you're talking to ISC about contributions. Do you have a finance and audit committee that you might want to, you know, have a presentation? So you can see like that engagement plan and pathway, I think is going to be vital to the success of the project as well. So, so I know we've been going for a little while here, John, coming to the end of the slides, but just a couple more here. Just want to acknowledge that we know, you know, different communities have lots of different circumstances and different capacities. And, you know, to the extent that they're interested in having a bit of technical support on planning their project, Finney be pleased to work with them. Could be that they just want to see a few models and they want to take on most of the, you know, responsibilities themselves because they got a lot of capacity. And that's a that's a scenario, sort of scenario one on the, you know, less Finney support. Could be the case that, geez, we, you know, haven't done one of these projects in a while. Wouldn't mind a bit more support. You know, do you have tools and templates? Do you have, you know, so would you be willing to participate on the project team a little bit? You know, when we get to the point where we've completed our business case, can you have a look, review the business case and make sure it's got all the right things in it? Not to say that it's, you know, pick the right procurement model or that the number is right. It's more about the process, more about the due diligence done the analysis and come to your conclusion, and you haven't really missed, big chunks. Like you haven't done a financial plan that only includes construction costs. It's like, well, no, guys, we got to do the operation costs as well. Let's go back and make sure we add all those in. So that's the kind of thing I mean when I sort of talk about reviewing the business case, really about the process and the due diligence. Yeah, and last but not least, just I know sometimes there's a confusion with the different organizations out there. Um, some are funding bodies. FNNBOA's not a funding body. It's really about capacity development and technical support and, complementary to the existing institutions of the FMA. But we know there's other organizations emerging out there, like the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, maybe others in different regions of the country, and we think they're complementary and look forward to working with them. So thanks for being patient with me and working through the the deck here. I've got just a bit of information if you wanted to reach out to Finny. Again, the website is fnii.ca, or you can email at info@finny.ca. And thanks very much for the invitation to talk today, John.
Excellent, Jason. Well done. Very informative. I guess the big question then for a housing manager to get their head around that relationship, because it's not a cut and dry. Infrastructure comes up to the street and the housing takes place, right? There has to be that integrative discussion, and we're trying to encourage housing to make sure they're part of that integrated discussions. They can't, when you build a road, let me know. Well, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, I think really helpful to have that team discussion about the timing of things. And I know, different people can be on different timelines, right? There's maybe an economic development timeline that is pretty aggressive. And of course, why wouldn't it be aggressive? You're wanting to take advantage of an opportunity. Maybe you've got an investor who's wanting to invest in a project and they want to get it started quickly. They want to limit the time it takes to build, and that would reduce the construction cost or professional fees. And they want to get that business operating pretty quickly because then they can start earning revenue. So delays are not ideal for them. Um,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then you may have other timelines like, well, it's one thing to want to get the business open, but what about community engagement? Do we have community buy-in for this? Is there a land code in place? Is there any other community engagement process, or are there other, is there funding available? Do we want to be thinking about the overall infrastructure system? Because if we made the pipe a bit bigger and extended it a bit, we could actually add the health center beside the new, whatever the development is,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So
Yeah.
it's just thinking about that in a bit of a more comprehensive way would be so, so helpful. Um, and maybe more cost effective on the infrastructure front, and then be more helpful to different proposals that people have. The worst thing, I just, community is very excited about a project, and they want to do it's a community building, and maybe there's an dev opportunity, and really, gung ho on that, and it's like, oh, well, have we thought about water and sewer? Oh, we haven't. Do
Yeah.
we have capacity? Oh, no, we don't. So it's just so important.
On that note, Claude, are you still there for any comments or insights?
Well, my comment is certainly this was a great presentation. It certainly
Yeah, wonderful.
it really helps support our previous webinars, and certainly I like the way it was presented. The information was just unbelievably good information, and hopefully people dig their heels in and see the advantage of what is offered here. Jason, thank you very much.
Well, really, thanks for the invitation, guys, and look forward to chatting again. And yeah, again, if hopefully we get a chance to talk about more projects progressing through that life cycle and that business case. That'd be great.
Yeah, and also our stuff that we just released on authority having jurisdiction and that whole bailiwick of, cost recovery through building permits. And so So we should have that talk. Probably I'll try to reach out to you next week. No, I'm in Winnipeg. Are you in Winnipeg next week?
I'm not, no.
Oh, okay. 'Cause there's a housing conference for the First Nation housing professionals. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Well, I'll try to reach out to you shortly after that. So many thanks.
Thanks so much, guys.
All right. Cheers.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.